In the Gospel of Matthew, there are just 3 verses that set the entire stage for one of the most significant events in all of history, the Last Supper. So today, we're going to dig into how a simple plan for a meal was actually this profound demonstration of prophecy and divine authority.
So it all kicks off with this really practical question from the disciples, where are we eating? But as we're about to see, there's so much more packed into this simple question. We're talking layers of precise timing, prophecy, and divine power. Believe me, these preparations were way more than just finding a spot for dinner.
All right, let's jump right in with verse 17 and the very practical question that gets this whole thing started. So, picture this. It's Thursday, right before the crucifixion. The disciples know the sacred Passover meal is coming up fast, and they come to Jesus with a really straightforward concern. Where should we get things ready? On the surface, it's just logistics, right? But the timing, wow, the timing is everything here.
Okay, so you really have to get the timing down to understand what's happening. The verse says the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the 14th of Nisan. Now, commentaries like Myers point out that even though the feast technically didn't start till sundown, it was common practice to count the whole day as the start of this big 8-day festival. So basically, the disciples are asking this on Thursday, and the clock is ticking.
And this is where things get really interesting for biblical scholars. You see, Ellicott's commentary points out that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what we call the Synoptic Gospels, they all present the Last Supper as the actual Passover meal. But John's Gospel, it gives a slightly different timeline, which suggests the lambs were being sacrificed right as Jesus was on the cross. It's just one of those cool details that shows you how the different writers had their own unique perspective.
So, okay, the disciples ask this very straightforward question. But Jesus' answer, which we find in verse 18, it's anything but straightforward. It's mysterious, it's super specific, and it's just filled with authority.
So his instruction is, go into the city to such a man. Get this, he doesn't give them a name, no address, nothing like that. But he gives them this message that's both a clear plan, I will keep the Passover at thy house, and also this incredibly heavy, profound declaration, my time is at hand.
I mean, that's the first thing you'd ask, right? Who is this guy? Was he a secret follower? Did they arrange this beforehand? You can just imagine the disciples looking at each other like, who's he talking about?
Now, Matthew keeps it short, but if you look at Mark and Luke, they give us this amazing little detail. Jesus tells them to look for a specific sign, a man carrying a pitcher of water. And that's a key detail because that was usually a woman's task, so he would have really stood out. And as Benson's commentary points out, this wasn't some wild guess, It was a specific pre-known sign that just proves Jesus' total foreknowledge of everything that was about to happen.
So you gotta ask, why all the secrecy? Why do it this way? Well, it was really for 3 big reasons. First, it was just a crystal clear sign to his disciples of his divine foreknowledge. Second, it proved that his coming suffering wasn't some tragic accident. It was planned and he was going into it voluntarily. And third, and this is so important for them, it was meant to build up and confirm their faith right before it was about to be shaken to its core.
And we really need to stop and just soak this in for a second. My time is at hand. This one little phrase, it just changes everything. It elevates this whole conversation from just planning dinner to signaling that the most important moment of his entire ministry, the moment all of prophecy had been pointing to, was finally here.
All right, so that brings us to our last verse in this section, verse 19, which shows us exactly how the disciples responded to these, pretty strange instructions. And what's so amazing here is how they just did it. There's no record of them arguing or being confused. No questions asked. They simply did what Jesus told them to do, and because of that, they made ready the Passover. Mission accomplished. And making ready sounds simple, but it was a whole process. First off, it was this huge act of faith, just following these cryptic directions. Then they had to go into a bustling Jerusalem and find this one specific guy. And then they had to find that large, furnished upper room, just like Jesus said they would. And after all that, they still had the practical job of preparing everything for the meal, the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, the wine.
And that, right there, was the whole point. By following his strange instructions, they saw every single tiny detail unfold exactly the way he said it would. Can you even imagine what that must have felt like for them? This perfect fulfillment of his words was meant to strengthen them, to prepare their hearts for the absolutely devastating trial that was just a few hours away.
So what's the big takeaway here? Well, these 3 little verses show us that getting ready for the Last Supper wasn't just a chore. It was a powerful lesson. It was a clear demonstration of Jesus' authority over everything.
and it was a massive confirmation of faith for his disciples, right when they needed it most.
And that kind of leaves us with this final big question to chew on. The disciples' simple, unquestioning obedience prepared a physical room, but in doing that, they set the stage for one of the most sacred ordinances and for Christ's final teachings. It really makes you think, doesn't it? What amazing, greater events in our own lives are set in motion by our own small, simple acts of faith.